Okay, so we showed that a couple of times last week in the morning and the evening service. I thought it was worth showing again this morning, just so you can sort of catch up with where we're at. I think you can see from using the Bible stories that were used there that Jesus, according to that definition that we used earlier, he acted willingly and intentionally. In the case of humankind in need, a huge community in need, with unimaginable, really, for us, cost, and without any sense of recompense or gain. Now, some of us here today, looking around, knowing you and knowing the morning crowd particularly well, many of us here today would be actually quite happy to agree with that PowerPoint slide that's up there, okay, wouldn't you? You would. Jesus is my hero. I think my superhero, it says up there. But I know, looking around too, that there'd be some of you who'd be going, actually, you know what? He's not. And some of you will be somewhere in between those two things maybe. I don't know if it's in between, but in another place, which is saying, well, maybe, but I'm not sure. Or maybe some are even thinking, possibly that's where I'm stepping to, but I'm certainly not there yet. And like I said last week, we really want to make a space in this series, but not just in this series, in this church, where wherever we are in that whichever one of those statements we might tick as true for us, there's space for us to be engaged and have conversation. What we're going to do in evening services, they follow the same themes, but they run a little differently. And starting tonight and for the next 2 Sundays, people from the congregation, tonight it's Jared Avila, are going to tell some of their experiences of when they were the beneficiaries of someone behaving heroically. But they're going to talk about how that impacted or affected or influenced their understanding of who God is. So you might want, at some stage in this series, to get along to one of the evening services to hear about that. We're going to talk about, we'll give stories in the morning service as well. But what I want to do this week and next week is talk about 2 things that I think we can actually practice to make it more likely that we are going to be the sort of people who live heroic life. So it's one thing to know the definition, to know the characteristics, but what are things that we can do that will help us be more likely to live the life of a hero, assuming that's something that we want to do, something we think that our community needs. So the thing that I want to talk about today, the first thing that I think will help us to actually be heroes is to dream about home. Heroes dream about home. Fictional heroes do. Superman did. Where was his home? Come on, Krypton. Remember, it got exploded in a big explosion, but apparently it was an amazing advanced civilization, and depending on which story you read, Superman was the only one to escape, but then there might have been Superboy and I don't know, all these other people. It depends on your particular strand you follow. But he escaped and he came to the planet Earth, and inspired by the wisdom and the beauty and the advancement of his own home, he tried to do what was right and good on the planet Earth. But I do get Superman is not real, so the better question is, do real heroes dream about home? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. did. I wondered whether to use him today or not. He's such a classic, almost stereotypical hero in some ways. But when I looked in again at his story, I thought, yeah, he's right for today. So Martin Luther King Jr. did. Let me explain. He was a Baptist minister, pastoring in the 50s and into the 60s, and he was also a civil rights campaigner. He was an African American. Most of you will know that, I'm sure. He was assassinated at about 39 years of age, I think he was, in 1968, but not before. He had done some amazing things, led an amazing movement that began to see incredible release from oppression for African Americans. He did some amazing things in his relatively short life. 3 things about Martin Luther King. The first thing is he was a compassionate man. He was compassionate about the things that he saw around him. And in 1963, he delivered a famous speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he apparently, the story goes, he had a script prepared, but he got a few sentences into it and he put it aside and he just spoke out of his passion and his compassion. And it was just so full of concern. It's why we quote him all these years on. And you know which speech it is. It's the I Have a Dream speech. So I'm not going to read it all to you, but just a couple of little paragraphs out of it. He said, I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, so he's talking about his own nation, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He wasn't tackling gender issues at this stage. He was dealing with other issues, so you'll have to excuse some of that. I have a dream, he said, that one day even the state of Mississippi, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged by the colour of where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin. He went on, 17 minutes of what he was dreaming about. And his dream was full of compassion. Martin Luther King was a compassionate man, but do you know what? He was also an angry man. He was also a very, very angry man. He got a lot of criticism from Christians, but also from actual pastors and leaders in the Christian church, white pastors and white Christian leaders in the church. They said to him, even if they agreed in principle with that, it wasn't fair, they kept saying to him, look, just go slower, just be quieter. Let's just take this thing a little bit at a time. It's going to happen. But you're just too outspoken, you're making too much trouble. And he was put in prison in 1960 for leading a civil rights march, and he got heavily criticised in the media, in the public forums, for just making too much noise too early on and in inappropriate ways, and he wrote a letter. Here's part of what he said. He was told to wait. He said, perhaps it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you see the vast majority of 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in a very affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the brand new public amusement park being advertised on the television, and you see tears welling up in her eyes when you tell her that Funtown is closed to coloured children, and you see the ominous clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky. When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the corner of your automobile because no motel will accept you, he went on, and he said in the end, there comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. Wait? I'm not waiting, said Martin Luther King. He was angry about injustice and he was done waiting. So he was a compassionate man. He was angry about injustice. And often we see that in people, but I want to say today that those two things alone, they're not always a good mix. Compassion and the passion that goes with it and anger, that can turn ugly pretty quickly without a third thing. There's a third thing that Martin Luther had. I think it's an important thing. And the third thing is hope. So if you add to compassion and anger about injustice, hope, you've got something different going on. And Martin Luther King was a hopeful man. He said at the end of his I Have a Dream speech, I have a dream that one day each valley shall be exalted and every hill and mountain made low. The rough places will be made plain and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed and all flesh, all humankind shall see it together. And I think that's what made him a hero. He was a compassionate man. He was angry about injustice, but he was also full of hope because he dreamed of home. King was persuaded, even with all the evil he saw around him, he was persuaded that the future would be different to the present day. He believed that human history is the story of God at work building a kingdom, building a home that will be a good place for everyone to live. King dreamed God's own dream for humankind. I think Martin Luther King dreamed of the home that God is making. So I want us to think about home for a little bit. I'm going to borrow some of the language which I've taken and tweaked slightly from a guy called Scott Higgins, who's done many things, but he's responsible for the catalyst groups, actually, that come out of Baptist World Aid Australia and the advocacy behind them. And he talks about the world, about home, with some useful language that, as I say, I'm going to borrow. He talks about home in a number of categories, if you like. So he talks about home as it was meant to be. And the creation stories of the Bible, they paint a picture of a community of people and creatures spreading across an abundant and beautiful world, filling it with just, loving and worshipping communities where people, the earth and the creatures flourish. That's the essence of what those stories are about right at the beginning of the Bible. We're not going to read it now, but if you want something beautiful to read in the week as a description of what home as it was meant to be, read Psalm 104. Really worth having a read through that. So there was home as it was meant to be, described in poetic metaphorical language in the beginning of the Bible there. And then there is home as it is. So Martin Luther King, he was really unhappy with home as it is in his day, or home as it was in his day. And I think, that was for good reason. I think he had good reason for that. He knew that how he and so many people experienced life was not how home was meant to be. And I'm going to dare to say that no matter what measure you use, no matter what your religious persuasion is, no matter what your age, no matter what your ethnicity is, no matter what you understand the purpose of the Bible to be, if you look at those first 2 chapters at the beginning of the Bible, I think we could all agree that that's not how the world is. That's not how the world is. Home, as it is, looks a lot more like the next 9 chapters of Genesis than it does those first 2 chapters of Genesis. And I was thinking about that. What happened in the story after that time? And I don't know if it is a simple way to put it. It helps me to understand it. But it seems to me that human beings started living beyond themselves, really. So not so much in the image of God as little gods ourselves. And the story goes that Cain kills his brother, and the world is soon full of violence and injustice. And although, it's good, thankfully we can look around and we can see examples of God's goodness in the world today. That's very, very good. But we know that far too much of what we see is made ugly by violence and injustice. Just a fact. It's made ugly by hatred and greed. And I think for us, perhaps in the Western world, it'd be interesting to hear Ruth and Simon's take on this a little bit, having just been in Africa. But I think for us in the Western world, some of the ugliness of what we see around is the result of our complacency. Kind of, what's the point? What can I do? This is just, caught up in that. All right, so that's the story at the beginning of the Bible. I want to flip right to the end of the story now. Do you ever do that when you're reading a book? Yeah. I was thinking about it. I do that when I'm anxious about how the book's going. So if I'm thinking, do I really want to commit to this book? I'm not really liking the trend. I'll flick quick to the end just to get a rough idea that the people I've already decided I really like are alive at the end and that sort of thing. But anyway. So the last 2 chapters of the last book of the Bible, Revelation, they make a beautiful bookend to the first 2 chapters. So the last 2 chapters describe new heavens and new earth, which are an echo of the heavens and earth at the beginning of the Bible. The last chapter has a brand new tree of life. Do you remember the tree that caused the trouble in the story at the beginning? There's a tree of life in the end of the story too that's going to be, both a sign and a source of well-being for all the people who live in this new home. So this home at the end of the story is the home that Martin Luther King dreamed of. It's the home talked about way back at the beginning, and it's the home described all the way through the story that the Bible tells, God's story. I believe that's what the Bible is showing to us, is revealing to us God's story, his engagement with humankind. And there's lots of different places in the Bible that you could put out and say, here's an example of home as it is going to be, as it is to come, being described. But I've chosen to take something from Isaiah this morning. But I'm not going to read it all to you, but before I read some of it to you, I want to say this, because it might cause some confusion when you hear it. So remember, as you hear the words, that Isaiah is trying to describe home as it is to come to people who are living in home as it is. So there's some things that you and I just cannot imagine because we don't have experience or the words. We're constrained within time as we understand it. We're constrained within life as we understand it. So we don't really have a capacity to understand other than what home as it is to come is like, other than to have it expressed and described in terms of what we do know and we do understand. Does that make sense? So Isaiah is trying to describe a home which is totally, where we will all be totally provided for, totally happy, totally secure, and totally at peace. And he's trying to describe that in the way that, with language, in the way that we understand the world as it is at the moment. So we'll put it up on the screen. I'm not going to read 17 to 30. You can read that for yourself later, but let me read you some excerpts out of there. So 17. See, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. And then in verse 20, never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. The one who dies at 100 will be thought a mere child. The one who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed or cursed. So let's just stop there for a minute. In the world that we know, death does a couple of things. Sometimes it cuts life off before it's started. Death sometimes cuts life off before we have considered that it has matured. We all know that, and we've all experienced that in some way. So Isaiah is taking what we know, and he says it won't be like that in the home that is to come. He's not saying here that death is still going to be part of life in the home that is to come. He's saying that over the whole of life as we currently understand life to be, the power of death will be destroyed. Describing it in terms so that we would relate to. And he goes on, they will build houses and dwell in them. In other words, what you build, you will get to live in. You will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. People won't build houses and have others live in them, so no oppression or injustice in that way. People aren't going to plant food that they don't get to eat, that others eat in a negative, oppressive way. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. My chosen ones will long enjoy the work of their hands. They will not labour in vain, nor will they bear children doomed to misfortune. For they will be a people blessed by the Lord, they and their descendants with him. Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox, and dust will be the serpent's food. They will neither, I love this sentence, they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. So that's home as it is to come. And I know some of you will be sitting there saying, well, that's lovely. That sounds very lovely. Beautiful poetry expressing our deep human need for it to be better, for there to be something beyond the limited goodness that we experience now, something beyond some of the horrors and evil that we experience now. You might even say it's exactly the sort of poem that someone like Martin Luther King would have to hang on to, probably just to get up in the morning. And not just him, plenty of other people beside him that were crusading for what seemed to be right for other people. They need something like this just to keep sane. But is it real? I believe the world that is being described there, not in that literal detail of what was described, but the world that was being described there that we feel and experience in our heads and hearts when we read it, I believe it is real. I believe it's real because of Jesus and because of the story of his life that we saw on the video. And I also believe it's real because of Jesus, who was physically raised to life in a body that is suited to and ready for life in this new home that is to come, which we try and describe in language of home as it is now. And you read in Philippians chapter 3 about that new body, and we're told there that it's for us too. So I've talked about home as it was, home as it is to come, and there's just one more. I'm going to call this one Home as We Are Beginning to See It. So when Jesus was alive on this earth, he talked about the kingdom of God as a way of describing home, really. A home as it will be. I think it was when Jesus was talking about the kingdom of God, he was telling us about home as it will be, but he was also using it to describe the home we are beginning to see now since the time that Jesus came. And his own life modeled the sorts of things that you can expect to see in home as it is to come and in home as we are beginning to see it. So Jesus dreamt of home, and he lived his life according to that dream. He welcomed outcasts. He did what he could to encourage others or to personally himself make sure that wealth was redistributed. He challenged the powerful and those with authority when they were using that in an abusive way. He was always acting with justice and grace and love at every turn. And the other thing that Jesus did is Jesus forgave us and continues to forgive us our offences. And I think he did that to free us from guilt. Because when we're bound up with guilt, it's actually quite hard to dream. I think that's what Jesus did at the cross. He liberated us to live a life that is free from guilt so that we can start to be changed. And we can dream. We can live differently. He made a way for us to be liberated from the guilt that I do believe keeps us from dreaming of home. It preoccupies us with other things, not even necessarily with our own things. It preoccupies us with, well, what's that person doing and why are they behaving like that? You have a think about that over the weeks to come. We tend to look at the cross and talk a lot about sin, and that's, our offence, our brokenness is an important part about obviously what happened at the cross. So you don't get guilt without offence. But the freeing work of the cross, I think, is liberating us from guilt. And with that off my shoulders, I can dream. I can think differently. I can be changed. So what I want to suggest is when we dream of home, when we're liberated from guilt and we dream of home, the compassion we have is no longer impotent, because often it can be. It just boils away inside us. And neither is the anger that we have about injustice destructive. Because heroes who dream of home, as God's story describes it, and Jesus lived it, can change the world with that combination of compassion, of anger over injustice, and hope reflected in the dreams we have of home. Home as it is to come, and home as we are beginning to see it. I believe that once we have that sort of dream, we can change the world. Martin Luther King did. You know some of the great names out of history. William Wilberforce did. The whole hundreds and thousands of people who got behind the Jubilee Debt Campaign and the Micah Challenge to help eradicate debt, they did. Anyone, in very small ways, anyone who buys sustainably produced clothing or chocolate, like we did at Easter time, they are. And so are those who give so that the people of Nepal can lift themselves out of poverty. So are those who campaign for the rights of displaced people. So are those who act as coach mentors. You're going to hear a bit more about that in the next 2 weeks. So are those who are relationship counsellors or financial counsellors or baby holders and food parcel deliverers. I want to say really clearly today that these things are not noble distractions from the main work of being a follower of Jesus. They are not distractions from the main work of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I think they are actually the things by which Jesus will recognise us. Some of you have been in church long enough to know the story of the sheep and the goats. I think these things are the things by which Jesus will recognise where we fall in that story. I think they are evidence that we are dreaming of home. So I want to say today, and I hope this isn't heavy on you, I want to encourage you and inspire you to this. Be compassionate. Be angry about injustice. We should be angry about injustice. Life is so comfortable for us. I really struggle with this one. I see stuff and it's just so easy to let it go through to the keeper. Someone else, some other time. There's too much going on. We got to. I feel like I need to learn to be angry about injustice again. I get the compassion bit, but then it's kind of gets stalled up at the be angry about injustice. But let's do it all with great hope. Let's dream God's dream of home and do something heroic as individuals and as a church family. So we think about those three things. Be compassionate. That's really important. It's got to matter to us that someone else is hurting. But actually don't just leave it there with, oh gosh, that's sad, that makes my heart feel sad and sorry. Actually get angry enough about the injustice to want to do something. But do that something with your head full of the dream of home as it is to come and home as we are beginning to see it.